Welcome everyone to the NRCoP National Hybrid event, the Political Astute Regulator. For those of you who haven't met me, I'm Chris Walker. I'm the Academic Director of the ANZSOG Executive Masters of Public Administration, and I will be hosting today's event. So before we begin, on behalf of myself and the panel, I would like to acknowledge Palawa people, Aboriginal people of this island, the Lutruwita Island, Tasmania, on which we all gather today. And I want to pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining with us today. This is ANZSOG and NRCoP working together, so it is natural that I would also like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of lands from where you're all coming from, but further to extend that respect to Māori as Tangata Whanau and Treaty of Waitangi partners in Aotearoa, New Zealand. I want to pay my respects to Māori who are in attendance today. We're coming to you live from Hobart, Tasmania. We have a room full of engaged and enthusiastic regulators, and they're keen to hear from our panel that we have. We have an online audience of about 200 joining us from both across Australia and Aotearoa, New Zealand. So before I introduce our panel, there are just a few points about the webinar. So the webinar is being recorded and it will be made available on the NRCoP YouTube channel. We'll be using the Q&A function in Zoom. So for our online audience, please post your questions through the Zoom function. And we will have quite a good chunk of time to respond to your questions after the panel discussion. If you like a particular question that comes up, you can upvote that question. I've got a laptop over here where I can see the questions bubble up, and that'll be encouragement for me to ask that question first. If the live stream cuts out for you, please stay online. The NRCoP team will be working to make sure we rectify everything. If your internet connectivity drops out, then obviously you're with a bad provider, but also we suggest maybe your connection, you can reconnect and go back to the Zoom link. So today we're here to talk about the politically astute regulator, and this is an interesting topic, particularly because our general immediate assumption about regulation is impartiality and somewhat removed from the political context. We regulate in a sense to ensure independence and give guidance to decision through rules and structures that mean there's a level of consistency and impartiality. So how does political astuteness, or political nous, as quite often it's talked about as well, how does this play a role in leadership in the regulatory context? That's the topic for today, and we have two great speakers who I will soon introduce to give us their leadership experience in complex areas about how this might play out. But I'd like to just briefly talk to some ideas about how public sector leaders particularly give consideration to their role in a context of impartiality, but in an environment that is readily known to have kind of a political context. There's been a lot of research on political astuteness in the public sector and how public sector leaders might engage or practice certain skills. Jean Hartley from the UK is particularly well known, and even in ANZSOG, we've had a number of scholars and researchers, John Alford, Sophie Yates, and our practice fellow Sally Washington in New Zealand regularly publishes short pieces on political nous and the importance of understanding this in a public administration context. In ANZSOG, one of the key things, particularly through the Executive Masters program that I'm responsible for, that we focus on is around public value. And public value is an interesting concept to kind of take as a lead into the role of political astuteness, because the concept developed by Mark Moore at Harvard, which has been around for more than 20, 30, almost 40 years, does kind of draw awareness to the authorising context of decision making, which is essentially political. And in a very simple sort of form, his model can be described as this triangle in a sense. Of one component, there's the operational capability of what agencies might be able to deliver, and in the regulatory context, it's the operational capability to enforce and make judgments. And at the peak of this triangle is the authorising environment, the structures within society and the political context that give legitimacy for these resources to be used in the way they are. So for regulators, where often you're exercising control and decision-making over others, you require the authority of the state to give you authorisation to act. So that's particularly important in a regulatory context. And these two elements calibrate themselves in a sense to deliver value, the outcome that the community is seeking from the investment of state resources in these sorts of activities. But Mark Moore and other scholars like Janine O'Flynn and John Alford say that, this is a dynamic relationship, these three elements, and that often you would find as a leading regulator or public sector manager, the dynamics shift, and sometimes it's not necessarily a question of can we do it, that's fine, we've got the resources, but it's more about the legitimacy of key participants in that social or political environment, the policy context, to take action. And measuring that and responding to that in a way that ensures the substantive value that is delivered by that action is realised by key people across the community. So it's an important thing it's an important concept, I would argue, that makes us aware of the role of political astuteness and political nous. The complicating factor is that, particularly in areas that we're going to hear from today in live animal exports, assisted dying, is that many different groups come with competing values and strong personal commitments to the things that shape or the things that they believe should shape action in certain areas. And so for public sector managers and regulators, there's competing elements of public value frames or authorisations. And how do you manage that? And how do you respond to that in a way that ensures you're still committed to the role that you have as a regulator? And you're concerned about this because in the end, I would argue, it's all about kind of sustaining and building trust. That trust has really significant implications for how we regulate. Low trust environments lead to high levels of prescriptive regulation and action, and high trust environments, we tend to sort of permit more self-regulatory action. So understanding trust in a particular regulatory field is critically important. So how do regulators do this? Respond, build value and respond to sort of the political context? That's the question for today. And I'm very happy to have with us as our speakers, Rossana Carr, Assistant Secretary, Department of Agriculture, Fisheries and Forestry, and Louise Mollross, Executive Commissioner of Tasmania's Voluntary Assisted Dying Commission. We're going to hear from these two leaders in their field about their insights and understandings of the dynamics of political influence, I suppose, but also the kind of calibration of decision-making in highly contested environments that they work in. So Rossana, if it's okay, I will hand over to you and I'll let you start with it. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you to the Tassie chapter of the NRCoP for having me. I'm really thrilled to be here today to talk to you guys about live animal exports, or more specifically, livestock exports. And I think it's actually a really good place to start, because I think when we talk about live animal exports, you're all thinking the cows and the sheep on vessels heading overseas, but actually it's a far broader topic than that. We look after companion animals, so all those diplomats that we send overseas that want to take their cats and dogs with them, or birds or rabbits, they're all part of a live animal exports regulatory system. As is coral, randomly enough, because it is a living thing, and as is reproductive material, so whether it's sperm or embryos, they all sit under this. Interestingly, only 5% of all of that is actually livestock. 5% roughly reproductive material, and about 90% is the rest of the non-livestock stuff that you actually never hear about. Obviously, you hear about the livestock because it is the most politically sensitive stuff. It's the stuff people care about, and it's the reason that we have the depth and complexity that we have within our regulatory system. I'll take you back a little step in relation to, we've spoken a lot about public value. The livestock trade is actually quite a significant one to this country, so it's around about $1 billion a year, not insignificant. And particularly for rural and regional areas, a really big deal. If you think about Northern Territory, a lot of employment relies on the live animal export trade. A lot of our cattle come out of the Northern Territory. It actually supports global security, and nutrition also. I don't know whether many of you would have heard about Indonesia's Nutritious Meals program. They're looking at bringing in quite a lot of cattle to make sure that all of their pregnant women and children are receiving a protein meal every single day. They can't do that on their own. We're there to support them by providing a whole lot of cattle their way. They're not the only countries. There are many, many countries that can't produce, whether for lack of ability or lack of area, can't produce the protein that they actually need to feed themselves. And that's where we step in. Interestingly though, it's also really important for our own food security. Now, you wouldn't think that a country like Australia has an issue with food security. We essentially produce between 70 and 80% more than we actually need in relation to horticulture, grain and animals. But what we are is a really major importer of processed foods. Most of those we don't process ourselves, they all get imported. What that means is that relying on those strong trade relationships, being able to export means that we can actually import. If we stop exporting, we may have to stop importing, which means a lot of the delicious things we all eat, we'd have to try and source somehow else. The live export or even the livestock system is absolutely a national regulatory system, but it's shared responsibility across a couple of different agencies within the Commonwealth and also state and territory governments. So with my department, we regulate and facilitate the export of livestock, but we've also got the Australian Maritime and Safety Authority, who regulate the vessels that these animals travel on. They do that through a piece of legislation called Marine Order 43 that talks about the structure of vessels, the stability of vessels, the equipment that's on vessels, to make sure that it's all conducive to a good animal welfare outcome for the animals that are actually being exported. In a similar way, the Civil Aviation and Safety Authority look after the aircraft that often carry animals. Not as many animals, livestock go by air, mostly do go by sea. States and territories play quite a big role in this space because they look after the animal health and welfare parts within their boundaries. They've got their own local biosecurity needs that will obviously influence the decisions that they make and the regulatory systems that they use, which obviously means that they come to us with different approaches and different pressures, which we've got to try and fit into that broader regulatory system. We rely on tools such as national vendor declarations, on disease freedom certificates, and also on their land transport standards, which do vary a lot from state to state, obviously because of sizes of most of those states. Interagency collaboration is really important for us. The political sensitivity is essentially why the system is as complex as it is. The livestock export industry would hate me saying this, but we essentially use every single tool within the Export Control Act when it comes to regulatory mechanisms. There's one that we don't use and we use a slight variation of it. So that I think pretty much counts as using every single one. A lot of other commodities that we regulate out of our department just use one or two. It all works depending on the risks involved, I guess. The regulation includes the entire supply chain. So from the moment an animal is selected to be exported all the way through to its slaughter, if that's where it was headed to begin with. That's a really odd concept, but I'll talk through it a little bit more. We've got something called ASIL, the Australian Standards for the Export of Livestock. It was introduced in 2005 and talks about sourcing, preparing, and the management of those animals within establishments or on vessels. Essentially, ASIL starts the second an animal is selected for export and ends when that animal disembarks at the importing country. And at that point, ESCAS, the Exporter Supply Chain Assurance System, takes the baton from ASIL and starts the process from there through to slaughter. The concept of ESCAS is that it is a way of us ensuring that there's a humane treatment all the way through to slaughter for our Australian animals that are in importing countries. ESCAS does sound like a bit of an overreach because it almost feels like we're trying to regulate what other countries are doing, but in fact, the person that we regulate is the exporter, and it is their arrangements that they have in place with their importers and their contracts overseas that we actually regulate, not the exporter country at all. So in the exports process, there are obviously exporters involved. They hold approvals, some of them various approvals, depending on the animals that they're sending, depending on the countries that they go to, also depending on the size of their operation. And any vets, many vets involved in the live export process. So if they're vaccinating, treating, inspecting, they're required to hold approvals under the legislation also. Both sea and air consignments for those animals are often having to be prepped at an establishment that is approved in some way, or a premises, a farm, or a property that is approved in some way. And that's all the community expectation part of the regulation, I suppose. We also have to regulate to the importing country requirements. So if an importing country wants to see specific vaccinations or specific treatments take place, then that's part of the process also. In most commodities, the importing countries are actually the only thing that you certify to, but in a sensitive one like live animals, we've got all the community expectation part of the regulation that we need to take into account as well. Interestingly, the regulation or the regulatory system around this wasn't always this complicated. If we look back in history, it used to be a lot easier than this, or a lot more streamlined. Essentially what's happened is incidents of poor animal welfare over the years have drawn public attention, which have then led to broader reforms around the regulatory system. Some of you may or may not have seen quite a few years ago now, Four Corners programs that showed some really horrific animal welfare treatment in overseas countries. The one in particular led to the development of SCAS, because we realised we had to do something that went further than just putting the animals on the ship. We wanted to make sure that they were treated well when they arrived in their importing country. Because of this sensitivity, we've also got quite a layered compliance framework that sits around all of this. So throughout the supply chain, there's audits, there's inspections, there's investigations. We investigate every breach that happens, no matter how small, and the findings of each of those investigations are made very public on our website, even if the findings found nothing. It's just a way that we try and be a little bit more transparent around it. We do have the ability under the Act to name the regulated entities involved in any investigations when it's appropriate to do so, and at this moment, we're kind of thinking it's not appropriate to do so very often. We're keeping that one in our back pocket if we ever really need it. We've also got reports to Parliament that we do every 6 months. So they started in 2005, so we're pretty much experts at it by now. It covers sea consignments only. It talks about the mortalities on those voyages. It includes details of the exporters who had those consignments, and if there is notifiable mortality levels, then we have to provide an explanation of what actions the Secretary took in relation to that. So all very open. As you might imagine, we're on first name basis with the Minister's Office generally. Most of the branch is. We've got quite a few ministerials, and freedom of information requests are a weekly thing for us. Senate estimates, what a hoot that is for us, often brings intense scrutiny, but I guess that's reflecting the public and political interest in this space, which we can't deny. In 2019, we had the establishment of the then Inspector General of Live Animal Exports. It's now the Inspector General of Animal Welfare and Live Animal Exports. Really rolls off the tongue nicely. We've had 8 reviews completed since then, a whole lot of recommendations, many of which are still open. And if anybody was watching estimates recently, the reason they're still open is because it is a really complex system, and making changes to it, it's just never easy. There's a whole lot of roll-on effects that we always have to take into account. The really fascinating thing with our Inspector General, as most of you would know, their role is to review the conduct of officials within their remit. And for our Inspector General, that's basically only my branch and a little bit of someone else's branch. When you compare that to the Inspector General of Taxation or the Inspector General of Biosecurity, who are looking after thousands and thousands of people, it does make that scrutiny feel very real, I think. Really, the attention really reinforces the importance of our role as a regulator in maintaining that public trust for this industry, as touched on by Chris. Interestingly enough, despite the fact that we do report to Parliament every 6 months, we actually struggle with information sharing generally, which is probably something most regulators come across from time to time. In this particular space, the public often want really detailed information, particularly when there's an incident happening or if there's a particular export that they really want to get involved in, want to know everything about so that they can find out what it is that they can do to stop that export from happening, for example. It's a difficult space. We genuinely value the public interest. We understand it shows a healthy demand for transparency, but the privacy obligations obviously make it really difficult for us to share the amount of detail that the public generally wants shared. This is often misinterpreted as us trying to keep secrets, trying to hide things, when we're actually just trying to do the right thing, believe it or not. Unfortunately, in the absence of that clear information from the regulator, people will tend to fill in the gaps themselves, and that tends to lead to speculation, mistrust, and far too often misinformation, which then makes it that little bit more difficult to manage as well. It is a difficult balance, but I think it's one we take really, really seriously. One of the interesting things about running this branch is what we refer to as the vet versus the regulator. It's a really hard space, and I've got a really great bunch of vets working within the branch, many of whom navigate this beautifully. But there are so many times when they're asked to make a decision that they would make one way as a vet and are forced to make another way because of the regulatory environment we're in and the regulatory boundaries within which we've got to work. It's a really tough gig, and I appreciate them every day. I think the key thing for them is focusing on the value that they can add being part of the regulatory system rather than being outside of it, which is what a lot of other people are. Desperately trying to fix it from the outside is never as easy as being able to fix things from the inside. Essentially, I think the livestock export industry and the regulatory system that sits around it is complex and it's sensitive, absolutely. It has been shaped by years of history and by public expectation changing over those years too. I think if we look back to the mid-80s, the heyday of live animal exports, I think the public expectations were very different back then to what we have now. There was a comment I think Chris made in relation to public trust, and I thought I'd share with you. So NRCoP is the live export industry's R&D organisation, and they recently published a sentiment report called the Live Export and Community Sentiment 2024 from memory. The sentiment from the community has risen slightly since they started this report a few years ago, which I thought was great to see. But they also drew a link in that report between trust in the regulator leading to trust in the industry. So I guess ultimately that means we're probably not doing too badly if we've managed to lift the trust ever so slightly. There's always work to do, and another disaster coming will probably mean another piece of another layer onto the parfait that is our current legislation. But let's see how we go. Thank you, everybody. Appreciate your time.
Thanks very much, Rossana. And yes, some really good points there, particularly getting back to trust and the kind of challenge between professional commitment and then regulatory obligations, which I would have no doubt, Louise, are evident in the framework of assisted dying. So can I please ask you, Louise, to come and talk to your experience? Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. I started working in the voluntary assisted dying space in February of 2022. And joined with the other commissioners in May of 2022, and the legislation took effect in October of 2022. Obviously, Voluntary Assisted Dying Commission, we operate in a politically complex and at times challenging environment. Support for voluntary assisted dying is obviously dependent on ongoing support from Parliament and from the government. It's a state-based scheme. Each state of Australia and Canberra, but not the Northern Territory, now have voluntary assisted dying legislation, and it's all different, similar but different. So in Tasmania, we have the End of Life Choices Voluntary Assisted Dying Act of 2021, and that was introduced to Parliament as a private member's bill, and was subject to a conscience vote. So again, at the time it was politically charged, of course, and as was expected. The bill's successful passage through Tasmanian Parliament followed a number of previous failed attempts. Now, the manager at VAD tells me it's 4. I'm not sure. AI tells me it's 3. Google tells me it's 3. But there are a number of attempts to get it through Parliament. And understandably, it's created division. It's a sensitive topic and support for it isn't universal. I think those of us who've had to, at some stage in our lives, put down a family pet will know how emotional that is. Maybe voluntary assisted dying is easier because it's the person actually making the decision. But it is emotionally charged. Not all medical practitioners support voluntary assisted dying, but I think it's fair to say that the majority do, but there are certainly some who don't. In fact, one of our commissioners was completely opposed to voluntary assisted dying some years ago and was very outspoken in relation to it, but he had a quantum shift and he's one of its fiercest advocates. Private healthcare and residential aged care support providers have varying levels of support. So just because you're in an aged care facility and you have a terminal illness, don't necessarily expect that that facility will allow you to access voluntary assisted dying on their premises, because they won't. The Commission is a statutory decision-making and oversight body for voluntary assisted dying in Tasmania, and there are 6 commissioners. And we are supported by a small but dedicated staff who put in the extra hours needed to enable us to meet our functions. Voluntary assisted dying rates have increased 59% from the 23-24 to 24-25 year, with no extra funding, no additional support. So our staff are working really hard. As a statutory decision maker, the Commission is required to apply the law as it's written and to adopt procedural fairness in relation to its decision making, and its decisions obviously can be subject to scrutiny. It means that the decisions we make have to be legally defensible. We are specifically prohibited from issuing a VAD substance authorisation, which is the final paperwork to enable someone to access voluntary assisted dying, if we suspect that the Act's requirements have not been met. Our approval is crucial before a medical practitioner can prescribe the VAD substance. And VAD substances are physically kept under lock and key, but also the nature and the names of those substances are kept under lock and key. The functions that we exercise are crucial for ensuring that the voluntary assisted dying process protects and prevents people from having their lives ended unwittingly or unwillingly. And we've been fortunate, I think it's fair to say, that we have not, since inception, seen any matters where we've had any concerns that that was the case. But the legislation is robust and it protects people. So getting it right for us is crucial for building public and political trust. We've worked to ensure that the Commission operates with responsiveness and agility. Patients accessing voluntary assisted dying and their families at the end of life, and they may be experiencing varying levels of physical, emotional distress. They may also be vulnerable, scared and confused. And there's a navigation service that sits alongside the Commission, completely distinct, but it helps people navigate the process. And that there's a big uptake for that, and they work under enormous pressure. Practitioners are delivering, so medical practitioners are delivering voluntary assisted dying services with limited resources, and they do it alongside their other clinical work. And as we know, GPs, for example, and they're a high proportion of our practitioners who are providing end-of-life care, they are already overworked and underpaid. And for them, doing voluntary assisted dying work really is a labour of love. They are doing it because of the benefits that they feel. They are certainly not doing it for the money. They are spending long periods of time with patients and with families in emotionally charged situations. They're driving long distances and all the while being paid absolute peanuts to do the work. So it's hoped, obviously, that will change. But the legislation and the work that we do also protects and regulates those practitioners. The Commission's approaches recognises the pressures that not only practitioners feel, but also the navigation service and, of course, the VAD pharmacy service. They're operating within limited resources as well, and they're often required to balance competing priorities. And of particular concern to myself is the fact that our pharmacy service often has at short notice to drive to the northwest coast to provide the substance, or to drive to Launceston, and it takes two of them out of the office. They have young families and they work under enormous pressure also, and they're doing it to help people who are in really difficult circumstances. So the Commission's approach tries to recognise those pressures, and we often make decisions out of session which are reflective of and support an agile approach. So, for example, we try and work wherever possible in with the pharmacy service. If they already have the necessary people travelling to the northwest coast, we will, if possible, do a substance approval out of session to enable them to conduct more than one matter while they're on the road. The Commission has worked really hard since its inception to build trust around the rigorous nature of the voluntary assisted dying process and the effectiveness of the Commission's role. We've invited practitioners to meet with the Commission to provide feedback on the Commission's operation and to understand more about our role and responsibilities. And we haven't been without criticism from doctors because they don't like the paperwork. We understand that. It's a lot of paperwork. It is repetitive, but we've now received funding for a portal from the government, which is great, and hopefully that will make things easier for doctors because we are conscious of the time it takes to complete the documentation. However, we make no apology for that because we are required to regulate the processes and the procedures, and that's what we do, and we do it rigorously. Each year the Commission's annual report provides a forum through which we can share our observations and approaches, and that's been done this year, and hopefully I won't come under too much criticism for the recommendations that we've made as a Commission, but also some comments I've made in relation to some adverse publicity the Commission's recently received in Parliament by one of the politicians and by one of our regular doctors. We were criticised, I think, because they see our paperwork is too onerous, and there are allegations that doctors, of which we're already short, were dropping out of the system. None of that was true, and I felt that it was important for us to respond to that publicly in our annual report. We work to be politically astute, and the Commission's connected with and influenced by its state and territory counterparts. We're engaged with the Trans-Tasman Board Chairs Forum, and that's all the states and the one territory who've recently joined us who have voluntary assisted dying, but also with New Zealand, who I think from what we can see have the absolute gold standard in voluntary assisted dying. It's all funded by their equivalent of Medicare. It's amazing. While each state and territory operates under its own legislation, as I indicated, the provisions are broadly similar, and decisions and experiences of one jurisdiction share relevance for others. The Commission has reviewed its procedures in Tasmania following the publicly known Queensland medication incidents, of which there have been two. So it's really important for us to engage with our interstate counterparts to understand what they're experiencing, and certainly I think we're indebted to particularly Anna Mayo of the Commission for the support that she's provided to the Secretariat of other states of Australia and in particular New South Wales. We've worked really hard to build relationships with service providers. Initially, when we started, there seemed to be a little bit of a rub between voluntary assisted dying and palliative care. And I think we've worked really hard for there to be an understanding that we're both working in the same space and we should be working together, not in competition. We would like to think that we balance a compassionate approach with compliance by adopting a pragmatic approach and acknowledging that strict regulation of practitioners would have an inevitable impact upon access. So we do try to be pragmatic where the legislation allows us to do so. Where documentation is non-compliant, the Commission staff will contact practitioners and provide every assistance to ensure that the documentation becomes compliant. And so we're focused on identifying barriers to compliance with outcomes, including system-level changes. We recognise the emotionally challenging nature of the voluntary assisted dying work in its approach to and its communications with practitioners. So we're certainly not trying to be obstructive. We are trying to work with practitioners, but within our role as regulators. It's important that the Commission is seen to be impartial and apolitical, and we've taken a particular stance not to engage in public commentary on voluntary assisted dying policy in Tasmania, and we've made every effort to avoid Leon Compton on the morning show. We also will provide education about the Commission's functions and the Act's requirement, but we don't want to engage in that political environment. We don't engage with other advocacy groups other than to hear their experiences and perceptions of issues. I think that's an important stance that we've taken. I quite genuinely expected when I took on this role and my appointment was publicised that there may be people with placards outside my house, or I may be hiding behind the shelves in the supermarket. But I certainly had to do that in my previous life as a divorce lawyer. However, that hasn't happened with voluntary assisted dying, I'm pleased to say. So I think that we happily coexist with those who are opposed, and they have every right to be opposed. It's all about choice. So our strategic priorities and regulatory approach are shaped in progress, taking into account the formal and informal political temperature which is existing at any given time. And as I think has been identified in livestock exports, it changes. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to you today. Oh, how do we do this? Excuse me.
Thank you very much, Louise. Thanks very much. And we've got some questions coming in. So people from the audience, please continue to post your questions and I'll be sorting through them. But I do want to say, if I can just ask a few lead-in questions to start us off. Both of you mentioned this kind of political complexity or sensitivity and how it leads to further regulatory complexity. And I just wanted to ask if you have a comment on that, in the sense that, do you think that's a hindrance, or do you think it's actually kind of part of the evolving process of regulatory development? Because in a sense, those political challenges or eruptions in some sense do probably have a base in changing community attitudes. And so do you see it as a process that in a sense is appropriate for regulatory development? I'll start with you, Rossana, and then I'll go to Louise. Thank you.
I think it's a really good question. I think for us, as I mentioned at the bottom end of my talk, the fact that we have this regulation is the reason that we're getting less incidents, and it's the reason that public trust is increasing in the livestock export space. So I guess for me, that interest leading to additional regulation is actually proving to be a really good thing. I'm not sure the industry themselves would agree. They're a very highly regulated industry and in their view shouldn't be so highly regulated. I think it'd be really interesting to see what would happen if we did drop that regulation back a couple of notches, whether we would see quite a significant drop in that public trust. My feel is that we probably would.
Okay, thanks. Louise?
Thanks, Chris. Look, I think in terms of voluntary assisted dying, I think it should absolutely be highly regulated. I mean, there isn't a more serious decision to be made for someone as to whether or not to access a substance to end their life. So I support the process, but I also support it being very heavily regulated. And that's why, I felt a level of frustration when there was some criticism of the Commission for its regulation.
Thanks very much. We have some questions coming in, and one of the questions that's come up, which is about transparency. And you both talked about, in a sense, the way that you work seeks to give clarity and transparency to what's happening. Do you think transparency is the vehicle to help moderate political kind of sensitivities? It almost diffuses political concern. Have you got a comment on that?
I do, yeah. I think in general, yes, I think it does. So if anyone wants to have a look at the DAF website, there is a lot of information on there about live animal exports and including livestock exports. I think the public tends to see information and have more trust in it. The problem we do have is that there's only so much information we can give. We've got the report to Parliament that gives a whole lot more information than I would normally be able to give to a member of the public. That also seems to have given people a little bit more peace of mind. The biggest struggle we will always have is not being able to give the full transparency that the public demands, and that always does leave a sour taste in people's mouths, and the questions about what are they trying to hide, what really happened on that voyage.
Yes, I agree with what's just been said. There is, certainly for us, obviously there are considerations of a person's confidentiality and the confidential nature of what they may be looking to engage in. So that has to be balanced against transparency, and I think certainly our website also provides a lot of information, and the annual report also provides information that's relevant for the public. But given the small numbers in Tasmania of certain people accessing voluntary assisted dying in certain areas, we're very conscious of not providing specific reporting in relation to under certain numbers. So usually it's under 5. We won't report on that because while we do need to be transparent, we also need to respect person's privacy.
Balancing, yeah. No, thank you. Thanks very much. This is probably more a question for you, Rossana, but we've got a great question about industry champions and how they, in a sense, build an understanding of the regulatory context for the industry, and therefore perhaps the tension and heat in that regulatory space might diminish a bit because they understand why you're regulating and the value of regulating a particular way. But have you got a comment? The question is, how important do you see industry leaders and champions working with regulators in trying to understand what's going on and why?
Look, I think there's certainly a lot of key industry bodies within the livestock export industries. Not as many champions as we would like to see. I think there's always going to be quite a large divide between what the industry see as the right thing to do and particularly what animal welfare groups see as the right thing to do. And my role as a regulator is to kind of sit in the middle somewhere. If everyone's annoyed with me, we're probably sitting at around about the right place. There's just, the views are irreconcilable between industry and animal welfare groups. And the legislation tends to be based on the incidents that have occurred and the pressure that parliaments would have had at that time following an incident coming from the public, coming from animal welfare groups. So certainly the industry sees that they are over-regulated and would love to see quite a few steps back in the regulation. And I think that tends to be what they champion rather than the value that the regulation actually adds to the trust that they have from the community.
Louise, have you had any experience with kind of industry advocates in your field? Both, I suppose, on both sides, in a sense.
Look, I think what we've experienced in the VAD space is the tremendous support that we do have from some medical practitioners, because without them, we can't we can't do our job and people can't access voluntary assisted dying. And we've had some people that I would call champions in that space. Unfortunately, one, Dr. Tim Flanagan, who's recently retired, but we certainly have others as well who work around the state, and they work tirelessly to assist people when they're in need. And as I indicated, do so with little return. So we certainly have champions of our industry, but we have to, while we have the greatest admiration for them, we have to be very careful, I suppose, in talking of terms of success of voluntary assisted dying, because, you know, those two, success and voluntary assisted dying, sort of don't really work.
Thanks. Yep, got it.
For obvious reasons.
Thank you for that. So we have a question, and it's about social license to regulate. And so the question is, how can leaders of regulatory agencies build legitimacy and support with the broader public and their minister around their regulatory responsibilities? Like, what's your view on that kind of strengthening the social license of your operation?
It's a really difficult one, and social licence is a term that industry hate us using because they don't believe they should have a social licence. It should just be an industry like any other. But I think when there's emotion around the particular commodity, so in this space live animals, there is always going to be a social licence, and it plays a really, really critical role. I think the regulation as it stands at the moment is really supportive of that social licence. What we see happen with social licences is quite a drop around the time of an incident occurring. And I think it's important to note that when an incident occurs where you've got a vessel that, you know, has an engine failure or something goes wrong, it's rejected by a country, that's not actually always within the realm of the exporter to actually do anything about. It's just an incident that's happened, and it takes a lot of management, but the way it's viewed, particularly by animal welfare groups, is that it's all about the exporter doing the wrong thing. Most often the exporter hasn't actually done anything wrong. It's just a situation that's happened that we need to work through. But the social licence absolutely takes a hit every time something goes wrong.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Louise?
Yes, so I mean, obviously, we're in we work in a potentially fraught environment, but it's important that we are seen to be cautious and to properly regulate and to comply with the provisions of the legislation. Because it's important that people respect the processes and respect that we're doing the job that we are engaged to do, and we're doing it appropriately. I think that there's we've been very fortunate that there hasn't been any adverse publicity for voluntary assisted dying in Tasmania, but certainly we've looked very closely when there have been the difficulties that were experienced recently in Queensland to ensure that we don't follow down a similar path, and that our processes are robust enough to prevent that from occurring. But it certainly, social licence is very important, but I think it's important in voluntary assisted dying just to demonstrate to people that it is robust and we will require compliance.
Thank you. This is part 2 of that question. It's been voted up by everyone, so it's bubbled to the top, and it's sort of seeking your advice. What do you think are the 2 or 3 ways that regulators can actually become more politically astute and literate? So it's a connected question. I mean, and maybe you might think that's not a core function, but I would be interested in your feedback to the question, and the fact that it's been voted up a bit is interesting as well. Yeah,
it's actually quite interesting, because I think in the livestock space, export space, people assume that the actual changes that have happened to the regulatory system were actually based on, you know, what particular party was in power at the time. But actually what we've seen over the years is that what leads to all of these changes is just the incidents happening. It's the public pushing some of this stuff to happen. Knowing what, you know, particular colour is in power, what their views are on certainly things, certainly helps. But it hasn't been what's driven most of the change, other than in the live sheep phase out, where obviously the Labor Party had made a call quite a few years ago that was going to be an election commitment. people seem to think that because of that, that must mean that, the Labor Party are much stronger in relation to animal welfare. But if we actually look back in history, a lot of the regulatory changes and the regulatory reforms actually happened under a coalition government. So I think for us in the livestock export space, it's more about being aware of the public's views and the public's scrutiny on this sort of stuff, and advising our parties appropriately.
Okay, thanks. Louise, any comment?
Look, I think we need to also be alive to public's views about voluntary assisted dying, and we certainly have been. And the example I gave in relation to our communications with palliative care and how we have a very good working relationship with palliative care has been important. In terms of the political sphere, I think that because it was a private members' bill, we're very conscious of who voted for it and who didn't. I have to say that we've had no difficulty working with those members of government who may not be in favour of voluntary assisted dying, and that's created no difficulties for us. And so we bat on. Okay. I'm not sure that was a great answer, but
I think you've demonstrated awareness by, I think at that level of the Parliament, who's voting for and against is really critical for any organisation to understand when reform comes through. Reading what is said in Parliament and all that is a way of being informed appropriately about the type of public debate around regulation. So it makes perfect sense. Yeah, thank you. I think you'd be a bit remiss if you didn't have an understanding of Parliament's commitment and views on the matter. We've got a question, and Louise, this is real for you, and I'm not across the detail of this, but the question says, I understand under the previous federal government that if doctors providing VOD advice via telephone was breaching the Commonwealth Telecommunications Law, and that hindered access to voluntary assisted dying in regional areas. So the question following that is, have you encountered this and the interjurisdictional political issues, and how have you addressed them?
That's a big one.
Yeah.
So, yes, there are difficulties with electronic communications with voluntary assisted dying. There are provisions of the Commonwealth Criminal Code which may be breached. And it does pose some difficulties, which is experienced by all states in Canberra, or the ACT, who have access to voluntary assisted dying. There have been a number of forums which have reached out to relevant arms of government in relation to this, and we're certainly hoping at some point there'll be amendments to the Commonwealth Criminal Code that will allow people to be able to communicate in such a way in relation to the use of a carriage service. But hasn't happened yet, but it's just something that we have to work with. It's not ideal, but we work around it. We've always known it was there. It's been there from the start. So it's just something that we work with.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you very much. I want to move to a question that you brought up that relates to my opening thing about public value and the operational capability to deliver value. And Louise, you talked about GPs and, the constraints and financial pressures they face, like they're an important element of your delivery system in a sense. So you're dependent on external or independent parties to work collaboratively to achieve the regulatory effect you're after. And I'm interested, Rossana, if you find in your own situation as well, whether that operational capability that might be shaped by the willingness of others or the resources of others to contribute to the goals you're trying to achieve, particularly I suppose in that once your exporter is engaged in another country about welfare. How do you see that having an impact on regulatory goals and objectives? So for example, Louise, if the GPs stop participating, you've got a real challenge in terms of delivering services, right?
We have a real problem, and we are really lucky that we have a core group of GPs which do the work that's required. And that was my other frustration, is the comments that were made in Parliament recently, because what it was suggesting was that it was really hard to access voluntary assisted dying and that there were no doctors available to do it. And none of that is true. Look, we absolutely could do with more doctors participating, but I understand, you know, why a lot of them aren't able to take it on because of time constraints. So, but we have a core group who provide tremendous support to patients, their own patients, but also people that aren't their own patients that have been set up through the NAV service with access to doctors who will assist them. So they are absolutely to be commended for the work that they do, and you're right, without them we would be in real trouble. But we need to make it easier for doctors. I'm not sure how we do that, because it isn't just about what they're paid. And as I said, the doctors who do the work are paid a very minuscule amount, but they do it because of, one, there's a need, but two, they do it because of the what they take away from it. And the doctors who've talked to us about that, they say the work is wonderful work.
Okay. Yeah, great. Thank you. Rossana, comment?
Yeah, I guess in my branch there are certain roles that absolutely have to be vet roles. And I guess, you know, one of the conflicting things for vets is that their values, that they're supposed to be helping animals, they're supposed to be keeping them fit and healthy and alive. The vets in my branch are obviously doing the exact opposite of that. But I guess the value that they're bringing is that they're making sure that the process is followed, that the policy we're writing has actually got animal welfare at its core. And I think that is the value that they can add as the vet regulator. Here's my professional thinking about where this could lead. Obviously all fits within the regulatory system that we've got, but that policy can be better informed by having vets there.
Okay, thank you. Thanks very much. We had one really good question. It's a simple question. Do you think there needs to be reforms that allow for better information sharing between regulators and jurisdictions? So it's a pretty straightforward question. Any comment on that before we close?
Yes, I think so. So at the moment, you know, I mentioned that collaboration that we've got with the states and territories, but the reality is that in order for us to share information with the states and territories that they actually need to be part of our broader regulatory system, we've actually have to have agreements, separate agreements in place. I can't just send information to another state and territory about consignments that are leaving from their ports. We've got to have an agreement in place to sharing that information, and then I can share it with them. And it took us quite a while to get those agreements in place, and there was a period of time where we weren't able to share that information. It was an incredibly frustrating period of time for each end of that, because we couldn't give the states and territories the information they needed about consignments leaving from their borders, and they couldn't receive it. So we were all running a little bit blind there. Really glad that we've got it sorted, particularly with the major states and territories that we export out of, but I do think something a lot easier than having individual arrangements would be amazing.
Okay, thank you. Any comment, Louise?
Look, I think for voluntary assisted dying, it's a little bit different because we don't have a need really to share specific information. We can share numbers, facts, and figures, but I don't think there's a real need for us to share the information with other regulators. Okay. I haven't given it a lot of thought, but that's sort of without notice.
Yeah,
that would be my
you've
response.
got a network where you share practices and kind of principles, and that sort of shapes regulatory behaviour locally. And
but it's not. We're not working in a sphere where we need to share specifics as such.
Yeah, okay, no, thank you very much. All right, that brings us to the end of our time. I want to thank everybody who put in their questions, and I particularly want to thank our panel members, Rossana and Louise. Thank you very much. A really fascinating insight into regulatory complexity in areas that are got high levels of sensitivity and very committed, both regulators who work in the field, like you both said, but also stakeholders who have a really keen interest in how the type of services that you're responsible for and governing really shape the way our society is structured and organised, and it kind of is characteristic of, you know, who we are in a sense, the way we regulate death and dying and the way we regulate the humane treatment of animals. So I think it says a lot about us as a society. Thank you. That brings our online session to an end. You'll receive a short evaluation survey in your inbox. Please fill that out, take a few minutes to respond. The NRCoP committee really appreciate your feedback. Also, a few other reminders, if I may. Enrolments are open for the Professional Regulator, and that's the professional development program managed by NRCoP. That's delivered in collaboration with RegNet from ANU. So if you're keen to hear more about that program, please check it out on the ANZSOG website for further details. And for our Victorian, Queensland and New South Wales-based regulators, there are local upcoming events soon, and the details of that, they should be being displayed now on your screen. Otherwise, again, you can go to the NRCoP events website for details and you can register for that, and I encourage you to do so. Please keep an eye on our LinkedIn and website pages for upcoming events. And I really want to thank all of you. Thank you for coming along. Thank you to our speakers. You've been amazing. I really have enjoyed this very much. As you know, I'm a bit of a regulator, a bit of a reg nerd. I really enjoyed it. So thanks, everyone. Thanks for coming along. And I'll close off the webinar now.